I'd like to welcome you all to the panel entitled The War on Climate Science, Combating Misinformation and Attack Politics. My name is Christopher Oliver. I'm a professor of practice in sociology and environmental studies program. I'm also the co-organizer with Amy Lesen of this particular panel, and I'll be the moderator for today's panel as well. So it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce this panel today. For time's sake, I'm going to keep it somewhat short. Obviously, if you look at their CVs and the work they've done, they deserve a probably much longer introduction than I can give them right now. To my immediate right here is Constantine Boussalis. Constantine is professor in the Department of Political Science at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. Constantine's work explores various facets of climate communication, focusing on many issues, including the role of politics and political communication associated with climate denial organizations. To his right is Mark Davis. Mark is Senior Research Fellow and Director of the Tulane Institute on Water Resources Law and Policy in the Tulane Law School. He's also recently been appointed, last summer I believe, right, the Director of the Bywater Institute here at Tulane as well. Mark is a legal expert on water management and water resources. He's been involved in numerous important legal battles involving control and stewardship of the waterways around the state of Louisiana. I guess, Siobhan, we switched, but that's okay. No, it's okay. We can go. I'll just go with you. That's fine. Sorry, there is no real order. So, Siobhan Foley. Siobhan is Climate Action Program Manager within the New Orleans Mayor Office of Sustainability. She's a Fuse Fellow. As well, she previously worked for the Clinton Global Initiative and Center for Sustainable Energy. The mayor brought in Siobhan in summer 2017 to develop and implement the city's first climate action strategy, and you can go to their website and take a look at a lot of the work that they've been doing over there. And then to the far right at the end is Francis B. Roberts-Gregory. Francis is a Ph.D. candidate in Society and Environment within the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at University of California, Berkeley. Francis' work focuses on issues of environmental justice, environmental racism, as well as issues of sustainability and advocacy. Her dissertation work explores transcultural ecological knowledge, gender, and climate change adaptation. Francis has been involved and continues to be involved in many local activist-oriented events, including this previous summer she was part of the Climate Justice Youth Summit, or attended it as part of that. All right, now I'm going to turn the stage over to Constantine Boussalis.
Thank you, Chris, for the introduction, and Tulane and everyone for organizing this event. So I'll be discussing a little bit background on climate denial in the United States, and then I'll just showcase a little bit of my own work with co-authors that deals with this important problem. So let's see here. Oops. Sorry, which one do I press? Oh, there we go. I got it. Thank you very much. So, as we're all aware, climate change is a problem that we're facing, and humans are causing this problem. If we want to boil it down, we kind of have two futures that we're looking at. On the left, we have one where greenhouse gas emissions peak and they decline at a fast rate, and we're fine, kind of. And on the right, we have a doomsday scenario. We continue business as usual, and all sorts of horrendous climate impacts occur. The sad truth is that we are more on the right side of this than on the left side. So we need to act quickly, right? And so we have this major achievement at the international level. Back in December of 2015, all the countries got on board and they decided that we actually need to do something on this. And as was discussed in the keynote speech earlier today, it's not enough what we've agreed to globally. So projections say that even with the Paris pledges, we're still expected to be 2.7 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial era temperatures. However, this is an important step. Much more work is needed, obviously. And I think I'll argue, and I think most would agree, that American leadership on this problem is vital. America, United States, is historically the largest contributor to the problem and continues to be a major emitter of greenhouse gases. Now, the problem, of course, is that in the United States, domestic politics continues to obstruct serious efforts. So we went from signing the Paris Accord to kind of a bad situation presently, which we'll get to. But we know that, we have a sense, right, talking to our friends, our colleagues, people on the street, that this is a highly politicized problem. And what does that kind of hyper-politicization look like? Big word. Well, on the left, here's data from the previous Congress, and in pink are elected officials that have vocally denied or expressed skepticism of climate change. So in the Senate, about 38% of senators are deniers, and that's about 70% of Republican senators. And in the House, about 33% of representatives have vocally expressed denial or skepticism. That's about 58% of Republican congresspeople. Now, if we were to look at their voting records, okay, data from the League of Conservation Voters from the 70s moving forward show how this gap between the parties has become a gulf in how they vote. So if you're higher up on this, it means you're voting more pro-environment. I'm just simplifying it a lot right now. And so red are Republicans, blue are Democrats. We have a chasm here, actually, where on average, the Republicans are somewhere in the 2% pro-environment kind of voting area. We're going to skip this because I don't know where it is. But what I was going to show was that also in public opinion, there's a chasm, right? So if we looked at Gallup data from 2016, a simple question of are humans causing observed increase in temperature, or what I have here is temperature increase in the last century is mainly due to human activities, you would see that 85% of Democrats would agree with the statement, and around 38% of Republican voters would agree with the statement, okay? And this difference has grown over time, right? And so this is where we're at now, right? This is where we're at, okay? What my work is deals with understanding this denial, right? Which is actually quite unique globally, right? What is it that is driving climate change denial, both among voters and among elected officials? And the argument is that this is not by chance, right? This is not a random process. It's actually a product of a concerted effort from interest groups and what I'm going to argue here, think tanks, and others to influence the public and ultimately legislation. Okay. So social scientists and sociologists have kind of understood this process as the denial machine. So I'm borrowing here from Aaron McCreight and Riley Dunlap's framework, where we see that on the top we have this tier of interest groups, fossil fuel industry, corporate America, conservative foundations, that provide material support to, and I'm going to emphasize here, conservative think tanks, right, which generate misinformation, which is then disseminated to what's known as the echo chamber, the media, blogosphere, and elected officials. Right? So my work and my co-authors, we're interested in understanding the generation and dissemination of this misinformation and ultimately the impact of this misinformation in Congress and among policymakers. So, let's think about the think tanks, okay? Here's a graph of just showing the document count, the monthly document count of documents that are related to climate change that are produced by these conservative think tanks, about 19 of them. And what we see is that it's grown over time, right? So they're talking more and more about climate change, right, over time, peaking in 2009, right? The next question, of course, is, well, what are they talking about, right? So using kind of big data approaches and computational content analysis tools, we're able to map the topics, the discussions that are produced by these actors. And really what it comes down to is that these conservative think tanks discuss the science, right? They discuss energy energy regulations, energy emissions regulations, policy, domestic and international politics, but also they focus on the integrity of scientists, right? And one question that we had was, well, which one are they focusing on more? Are they focusing about the policy more or the science more? Okay, because this is actually a crucial question, because if they're focusing on the policy more as time goes on, that means that, well, they're not really challenging the science as time goes on, right? And so we can actually have a discussion with these people, right? On the flip side, though, if they're increasing their discussion of science as time goes on, as the consensus among scientists about greenhouse gases and human activity and climate change becomes stronger and stronger over time, that suggests that the chasm, right, the potential chasm between us, between people that believe that climate change is a problem and those that deny it, is growing wider and wider over time. And so here's what we find if we just pick one influential group, the Heartland Institute, which is on the right side. We see that from 1998 to roughly 2014, what we see is that their discussion of science topics, right, has increased in salience over time, and the discussion of policy has relatively decreased, okay? And we see this for other organizations as well. So one point that I want to make was that this kind of dovetails with a strategic policy position or strategy that was agreed by Republican lawmakers, right? So there's this famous memo that was circulated in 2002, right, called Straight Talk Memo, which emphasized, right, directed the climate communication of Republicans to Republican lawmakers to emphasize to question the science, right? If we question the science, we still have a window that we can act within. Right? That was the argument. So, all right, that was the conservative think tanks. Now we can do the same exercise in the blogosphere. Okay, so we collected about 250,000 blog posts from about 50 or so influential denialist blogs, and we see the same kind of thing, right? So they're discussing science much more than policy as time goes on. Okay. So, unfortunately, all my graphs are gone. I don't know what happened here, but it's fine. The next, I'll be giving this talk on Thursday, so I don't want to spoil it too much, but another aspect here, of course, is, well, all right, we talked about all this obstruction that's going on at the federal level, right? Then perhaps the way forward right now is action and policy, pro-climate policy at the local levels, local and state levels. And so myself and Miriam Holman, who's a professor, assistant professor here in, associate professor, I'm sorry, in the political science department, we've worked on the press releases, the climate communication of cities, major cities in the United States. And what we find is actually that if you account for how liberal the locale is and the political affiliation of the mayor and other kind of city level characteristics, the climate vulnerability of a city actually influences whether a mayor talks or does not talk about climate change in their press releases. So this is actually quite hopeful in the sense that, well, we know that there's obstruction at the national level, but at least at the local level, tentatively, of course, I'll talk about kind of nuances of this research on Thursday, but it seems that this partisanship is breaking down at the local level, okay, and this is actually quite important and hopeful. Okay, so what can you do to help this kind of academic research and also understanding climate denial? Well, I'm working on a project with, among others, John Cook at George Mason University, and we're coming up with an automated system, or a system that will automatically detect climate change denial in any piece of text that you pass to this system. So we're training an algorithm to detect and to classify the type of climate change denial. It's not us, it's not happening. It is happening, but it's not bad. There's nothing we can really do about it, and also scientists are just political tools, right? In a nutshell. So if you're interested in kind of this type of work, you can be a coder. You can help us out. So I have the website up here, skepticalscience.com/cards, and you can help us code text that we use to then train the algorithm to help us out. So yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you.
All right, Mark Davis.
It's a pleasure to be here at Tulane University. Now, I'm a lawyer, so I don't feel comfortable pretending to be a scientist unless I'm really pretending to be a scientist. Because I think it's important to understand the appearance of science as opposed to actual science. And I am not I have a bachelor's degree in science, but it was in accounting, so that doesn't count for much. I just want you to know that, misunderstandings about science are nothing new. And what I'd like to pose the question is, well, if we know so much about climate science in particular, why do we keep making such horrible decisions? Why are we making bad policy decisions, lifestyle decisions, infrastructure decisions, all sorts of decisions? And I've thought about it, and I've consulted some pretty smart friends. And the short answers is because, A, we're people, and this is what we do. History will back me up on this. In fact, if you've not read Daniel Kahneman's work, things like Thinking Fast and Slow, whereas a social scientist, he won a Nobel Prize in economics for essentially proving that we're not nearly as rational as we like to think we are. In fact, if we used really hypercritical thinking the way science likes to use, we wouldn't cross the street because the number of factors we'd have to work through. So we go with what makes us comfortable. And the other is because we've set up a whole bunch of institutions. We're in one right now, a university. We have government. Most of us work for an institution, a corporation, an NGO, a church, something. And those have missions, processes, cultures, all of which were set up to do something. If I work for an oil company, my primary duty is to make money for my shareholders. That's it. It's my fiduciary duty to maximize their investment. Now, you can layer a bunch of other rules and things on me, and this is kind of what, a lot of legislation and public interest pressure do. They temper the boundaries of what you can do in the way of delivering your primary mission. But fundamentally, universities are in business to do what universities do. Governments, agencies are in business to do what government agencies do. Like the Army Corps of Engineers, for many, many years here in Louisiana, viewed its mission to keep the Mississippi River flowing by the city of New Orleans and to keep river water and Gulf waters from pouring over walls into the city. That was it. If you went to the Army Corps of Engineers, as a number of citizens did back in the late 1980s, and said, by the way, it seems like this coast is disappearing. It seems that it's flooding. And it seems as some of the things you're responsible for might be involved. And the Army Corps of Engineers' reaction literally was, and how does that affect us? Floods come from storms and overflowing rivers. They don't come from rising seas. They don't come from inundated land. They did not define what was happening in South Louisiana or any number of other places on the globe as a flood. Ergo, it was not within their mission. So in 1989, an eclectic group of citizens from Louisiana and friends elsewhere went to Congress and the state legislature to make it somebody's business. It was not within the mission area of a single state agency in Louisiana, nor was it within the mission area of a single federal agency, at least as they interpreted it. In short, they were designed to use science, but to ignore it at the same time. Indeed, I think since Groundhog Day is this week, we should always remember that fundamentally, we're more willing to take things like weather advice from rodents than we are climate evidence from scientists. And that should tell us something about ourselves, that this is really about a whole lot more than climate science. So while we can talk about the war on climate science, and we should, we have to understand that this is not just climate science, and it's not new. Case in point, let's take a look at the relationship between law, policy, and a number of things that touch on science. If I pick a dictionary out, hydrology is the science of dealing with the occurrence, circulation, distribution, properties of waters of the earth and its atmosphere. Not poetry, but largely accurate. Now, water law, which is what I practice, is about ownership, use, and control of water. And I'll promise you that most of those rules, which we inherited from colonial ancestors, had nothing to do with science. No hydrology, no ecology, no notions of actual social utility. It was essentially, if you had land next to water, you got to use it, and the guy behind you didn't, unless the king or sovereign reserved those powers to themselves. And indeed, let's see, I mentioned the coast. Now, this is from a study done by Shea Penland out of University of New Orleans and his team with USGS. Said from a local perspective, based on GIS analysis, 31% of the coastal land loss in Louisiana is caused by natural processes, and 69% is caused by human processes. Now you would think, okay, that means that government will learn from scientists. Well, this is a bill that almost made it through Congress, 1993-94, with largely Louisiana sponsorship. Congressional finding of fact, this was actually in the finding of fact, that most of the loss of wetlands in coastal Louisiana is not attributable to human activity. Why? Because it would be immensely inconvenient. And this is how, anybody here from Texas? This is still the basic law in Texas and Ohio, a few other places. It says the movement of groundwater is so secret, occult, and concealed that an attempt to administer any set of legal rules would be hopelessly uncertain. Now that was based from court decisions that go back into like 1700s, 1800s in England, when in fact we didn't know what was underground. To be honest, we've learned something since then. Law didn't change. Keep that in mind, that fundamentally, science is a process of positing ideas, testing ideas, validating ideas. It's based upon conjecture, doubt, and verification. Most of us hate that. Law is about predictability. Most religion is about predictability. You follow certain rules, there are certain responses. Science is not neat. And that's also, by no means, the number one factor in most decisions that you make, I make, governments make. And we have to remember that. And that's really a fair amount of what the war on climate science is about, is that if you don't like what the science is telling you, then find a way to attack it, find a way to use that doubt to undermine it. It's very easy to convince people that if the science is uncertain, that maybe the science is no good, or that maybe every other idea is equally as valid. That's certainly not science. I think it's fair to say that most people don't really understand how science works. And as I mentioned earlier, I think most of us, in our personal lives and in our jobs, are not as rational and thoughtful or as informed as we like to believe. In fact, my guess is if everyone who calls into a radio talk show believes that they are as informed as most experts. There's a remarkable democratization of opinion. I have even succumbed to this once or twice myself, normally talking about sports and things like that. But the fact of the matter is, we don't tend to respect our own ignorance. I want to make it very clear that, again, that new ideas or new evidence by itself does not change anything, by and large. That massive science information that came forth showing how much of coastal Louisiana was disappearing, which quite frankly science could have told you 100 years before, did not change one word of law, one word of the mission of anything, one allocation of resources. And indeed, when the information, the science said, by the way, of those human-induced causes, a lot of those are like logging companies, navigation, developers, farmers, oil and gas. Suddenly, it sounded like blame. And when blame comes up, there might be liability. And people go into the mode of opposing. And sometimes the easiest way for them to oppose is to oppose the legitimacy of the evidence against them. So never assume that a white paper is its own best messenger. I have never seen a scientist writing in the journal Nature, who then had to pick, was flooded with calls from legislators, program administrators, CEOs. That's not how most of us credential. Indeed, I think we have to recognize that science and scientists have to express and defend that work much more broadly than conventionally they have. The notion of essentially publishing in journals amongst your peers, hugely important to the scientific process. But the rest of the world is not obliged to read, follow those things. And if we want science to serve better, then scientists have to be encouraged to play bigger. Back when I was on the advocacy side, and before I came to Tulane, I was on the public interest advocacy side. I often worked with scientists. Okay. And they were very uncomfortable with me because they were worried that I was going to use their information in ways they weren't comfortable. I had to make it clear to them I was going to use their information one way or the other. The real question is, are they going to help me understand it? So that's the other piece, and because no scientist is their own best advocate. Science needs friends. It needs citizens who care enough to learn how to use it. And I also want to emphasize two last things. One is that, and I think this is very clear from Constantine's point, is for the most part, if you've got power, you don't need science to back you up. Most of us use science as a tool because it bolsters our point of view. Most of us don't embrace it because it challenges how comfortable we are. We don't like that. But in the political realm, science is the last resort of the politically weak. If you're using science, you should know that you have not you have not yet succeeded on a whole bunch of other things. Now, I'm not saying that that diminishes the importance or role of science, but advocates have been using science instead of organizing, instead of talking to their neighbors, trying to think of the things that motivate people, and you're asking science to do what it's not designed to do. I'll close with one observation, and that is, in the realm of climate, as I said, most people don't embrace science until it's a tool. It's becoming a tool. Constantine just mentioned it with local governments. We're seeing it with insurance. We're seeing it with bond raters. And the moment that people can't get insurance or their company can't expand because no one will lend them money because of uncertainty about whether or not the risk is real And this is happening now. And suddenly, the utility of science changes. It's no longer a mere public policy discussion. It's now fundamental to assessing risk and making decisions in a sphere that we have not seen up to this point. That was characterized by the Bank of England's head as the tragedy of the horizon. As citizens, our job, your job, is to telescope that horizon so information science can factor into decisions while it's still time for it to matter. Thank you.
Do you want me to go? It's up. Do you want to go last?
Yeah, I want to.
Okay. All right. I'm just gonna. There we go. All right. Francis Roberts-Gregory.
Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Francis Roberts-Gregory, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. I'm a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley, in the Department of Environmental Science Policy Management. So first, I want to start off with an excerpt from a speech I gave at the 2017 Berkeley March for Science. So bear with me, because it's been a few months since I've looked over it. So, who am I? I am the granddaughter and daughter of various peoples who were brought to this country as enslaved and dehumanized property for the sake of capitalist, patriarchal greed, and the desire to acquire lands that were never for the taking. I am the product of colonial herstories and histories of conquest, gendered rape, coerced labor, and scientific experimentation on enslaved bodies, particularly Black women's bodies, to develop modern-day gynecology. I am the heir to legacies of appropriation of indigenous ecological knowledge for the development of modern-day medicine, pharmacology, warfare, and geographical exploration. I am also the heir of legacies of racial classifications to differentiate human from non-human that sterilized my female kin, and racial terror that led to the migration of my family, field workers and sharecroppers, to the industrial north, and factories and industries that only hired them after affirmative action policies were passed. I am also the result of my grandmother's and grandfather's hard work to achieve the so-called American dream and finally buy property with their newfound earnings that also increased educational opportunities for my mother, who studied mathematics, chemistry, and biology, and me, who studied environmental science, anthropology, and sociology. I'm an individual from an extended family that has lived in geographies contaminated with toxic pollution, hog waste, and industrial carcinogens that polluted the soil, air, and water in North Carolina, New Jersey, and Georgia. But the stories do not end there. I am also the beneficiary of policies, programs, and philanthropists who decided that it was important to increase diversity in STEM, such as the Women in STEM program I participated in the summer before my freshman year at Spelman College. I'm also an alum of diversity programs to increase participation in atmospheric sciences, such as the Significant Opportunities in Atmospheric Research and Science program. These mentorship pipeline programs not only allowed me to be exposed to scientific research, map soil erosion, map tropospheric ozone, understand green spaces and accessibility, but also to work with indigenous communities dealing with climate change and sea level rise in Gulf Coast, Louisiana. Most importantly, they helped shape my identity as a woman in science and social science, and my desire to devote my career to increase the representation of people of color and women in STEM and the climate sciences, generally speaking. So I start to emphasize the importance of critically engaging what we mean when we talk about science and who is included and who is excluded. So how many of us have family members or friends or acquaintances that do not believe in climate change. All right, that's a lot of us. That's not good. But it's a reality that we all live with. And I think it's important that when we engage science or the attacks on science, that we don't only focus on, well, we are rational individuals, we have the actual truth, we are the ones who have been educated in particular institutions, but that we also focus on how different people bring different types of understandings and experiences with scientific institutions. And when we focus on that reality, I think that we can have more productive and fruitful conversations. So currently, my research leads me to ask two questions. What does it mean to be a woman of color, organizing for climate justice, and working to increase the representation of people of color in STEM fields? And who is currently funding and supporting work that investigates the intersection of gender and climate justice? I'm currently working with individuals from the NAACP to survey women's organizations on their best practices for integrating gender justice and climate justice. And I'm always surprised when I hear individuals speak on how hard it is to focus on the gender aspect of the climate justice work when they have so few resources and support to actually do the work around climate change. This work, which is often based in the United States, differs from the experience of researchers working internationally where gender is more mainstreamed. And so when I think about what is the impact of attacks on science and climate science on my particular research, I think about how women's organizations have a hard time even focusing on gender because they have to spend all of their resources on educating the public and increasing literacy around science, environmental justice, and climate justice, broadly speaking. I also think about how many scientists are becoming politicized, which I think is a great thing, but how, as one of the presenters here said, science needs allies. And allies are to be found everywhere, but oftentimes we aren't looking in the right places. So for example, many scientists, I've noticed in the past that many scientists do not always attend social justice rallies unless they are, of course, involved in activist communities. If we want people to support science, climate science in particular, we also have to support housing justice. We also have to support issues around gentrification. We also have to support issues such as fights against the prison industrial complex and educational inequalities. I also think that it's important that we grapple with, although there is obviously an issue with alternative facts, that there has to be room to explore different understandings of what does it mean to be a scientist, what does it mean to investigate truth. So coming from a feminist philosophy of science perspective, we understand that knowledge is situated, that knowledge is embodied. So with that being said, we cannot dispose of everyone who attacks our science because of their particular life experiences. We need to actually engage them and increase all of our literacies of different ways of living and being in the world so that we can come to some better understandings of how to promote climate science and science for justice. I also think that it's important that we engage in code switching and translation because as many of us who work in activist communities know, we do not always have the luxury to use one particular method or one particular strategy. So the way you engage with perhaps your neighbor or your grandmother or a politician might be different than the way you engage with your peers in the classroom. And I think that's great. I think that if we actually center this understanding of code switching and speaking to different audiences, that we'll actually be able to have science, climate science, and coalitions against anti-science that are more inclusive and more effective. So finally, because I actually am more interested in the conversation that we can generate together, I would just like to say that it's important to not be afraid to question science as we support science. I think a lot of us, or at least what I saw at like many of the marches for science, is that people were jumping on a bandwagon to support science without holding science accountable for the sins of the past, the present, and the future, and also its responsibilities to communities and taxpayers, and how to actually engage citizens in ways that are not paternalistic. So my closing statement would be, as you support science in whatever capacity you feel is appropriate, feel comfortable in engaging your own truths, and also knowing that it is okay to be a dissenting voice at times. So, thank you.
Sorry.
No problem.
There you go. All right, Siobhan Foley. Oh, yes. Thank you.
Awesome. I don't know how loud this is, so it's loud enough. So how many of you have seen the city's climate action strategy? About a quarter, okay. So I just thinking actually about Francis's talk, and just, you know, it's interesting when you talk about climate change and climate science and in any given sort of forum, just that idea of who your audience is and what are we talking about. We could talk about so many different things. I'm full of thoughts, having listened to everybody, as I'm sure you are. So I want to take a few minutes and talk about our strategy, just so you all have a better understanding of it. But I also just, how many folks in the room are undergrads? Great. And how many of you are science majors? Okay. And how many of you are thinking you're going to be looking at a career in business? Politics? Okay. Not-for-profit work? Healthcare? Great. Okay. I'm going to stop there. I could ask a bunch more I really want to know. But I think what each speaker has said today in different ways, but there's a thread throughout, is that science exists in a broader conversation. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It doesn't exist only in the classroom. We must bring science into our everyday lives. We must bring it into our, meals over Thanksgiving break with our families when we talk about climate or other things or politics. It exists sort of within a realm of all these other things. And I'll say, and I'm really interested in your talk on Thursday. I have to find out where this is. I want to know more about local governments and climate work, because I do that. But what's an interesting element about that you may not really think about a lot is local governments don't do this work necessarily because they want to, right? So I think that we have gotten into this situation over the last number of years as the international community has up to 2015, prior to 2015, had continued to fail to find solutions to this issue at that national level. It has continually fallen to local governments in the way that these things tend to do. They fall to local governments when other institutions that we set up, as Mark Davis talked about, other institutions that we set up to solve things for us as people, that's how we organize, and we set things up to solve things for us. As those larger institutions fail to do so, it moves to the smaller increments. And local governments are charged with community and economic development and safety and all of these risk management, all of these things that are really important to people where they live, right? And so you've heard, and we talk about thinking globally and acting locally, and it sounds great, and it is great, and we do need to do that, because at the end of the day, we're individual humans who live in families, who go to schools, who have jobs. We have a sphere of influence that comes out just from who we are out and grows. And working together, we can do a tremendous amount. And so at the local government level, that's really an opportunity for us to do that, working together. But we're humans, and working together can be quite difficult. So I just kind of want to preface all of this with that a bit, and then I want to talk a little bit about the strategy. I don't want to go into too much detail. I have a lot of slides here. I kind of brought all the slides, so I'm going to skip through a few things. There's stuff you already know. I have a copy of the strategy with me. It is online. It is at NOLA.gov/climate action, and you can see it there. What's particularly good about the strategy. I think if you live here in New Orleans and you haven't had a chance to look at it, we really took a lot of effort to put a lot of information in there. There's a lot of stuff about how does our waste system work? Why don't we have better recycling? How does our water system work? You know, it's an interesting thing here where we're located and at the elevation we're located. Water use in New Orleans is energy use. Did you know that? Who knew that? Great, that's great. People often don't really think about that, right? I think actually after the events we had in August and we've been thinking a lot more about our water system, people are starting to understand that more. But when I started here, I actually started in October 2016, I went to a neighborhood meeting with a lot of folks who'd been working on community building and resilience issues in the city for a long time, and I asked, what's climate action? And everybody said water. Nobody said energy. Nobody said transportation. People weren't thinking about the nature of how these things are all connected. And the reality is they are. I mean, and science is connected to politics, is connected to economics, in the same way that climate is connected to all these pieces. So I'll just take a minute and let me just... You know New Orleans is a coastal city. You may not actually think about it that much. We have levees. We don't necessarily see the coast in the same way, but our location is a precarious one. And in that way, it's a dynamic location at the mouth of the Mississippi River. We would have environmental challenges and opportunities even if there was not rapid climate change. That's true. But the fact that we then also have the rapid climate change exacerbates those things. We have a disappearing coast. You've talked about that a lot today, I'm sure. Our climate is changing. We're getting a lot more extreme heat and a lot more cold snaps. We're getting more variations. I had a professor in graduate school who liked to refer to it not as global warming, but as global weirding. I think that's a really helpful phrase. When I talk about that with people who tend to say they don't believe in climate change, they often respond to that phrase because everybody we're also animals. You know, human beings are also animals. We sort of sense that things are a little bit weird. They've gotten kind of weird. And so that can be a place of entry when you're talking to people. Sea level rise, of course, is an issue. This chart basically discusses the fact that we have built our levees higher, but the fact that our land is sinking and our coasts are rising means our levees are still not high enough. So these are the challenges and why we've done the climate action strategy. You know heavy downpours are increasing. I'm going to skip through most of this. This is all stuff you know. I want to speak for a minute about the context of New Orleans activity and sort of where we are. I think it was Constantine had mentioned that local governments that have more climate risk are more likely to talk about climate. We are a city that is recognized widely as having a lot of climate-related risk. We are a city that takes it very seriously. The mayor did sign on to the Compact of Mayors, which is now the global covenant of mayors on energy and climate. It's about 7,000 cities worldwide have pledged to take action on climate. We're also part of Climate Mayors, which has been an organization since President Trump has been elected of mayors that have stood up to say they want to help the United States keep its commitment to the Paris Agreement. There's 389 cities in that organization. We're a signatory to that. Signed on to Chicago. Mayors are basically running around signing on to each other's things right now. That's a lot of what we're doing. We're actually piecing together ways for local governments to work together because our institution, the way our government is set up, we have cities, we have states, we have federal, we're not really designed to do that. Traditionally, it hasn't been a situation where cities work with other cities in a lateral way to do this type of work. So this is all quite new. And a lot of what we've been doing lately is really finding ways to work together more collaboratively, but a lot of our systems aren't really designed for that. It's hard to do a joint procurement with another city. It's hard to think about how you don't really get economies of scale. We live in a world that is largely dominated by multinational corporations in our business world. Think about the kind of scale that is. There's charts on the internet where you can look at, major brands, major companies, and you can look at their revenues as compared to countries you've heard of. And you can see that some of these companies have functionally economies as big as countries, and vice versa. We don't have economies of scale at the city level. A city is a city. The city might grow, the city might shrink, but the city is not going to be able to necessarily work in that kind of frame. And we're up against a world that is doing that. And so that's something to keep in mind. And when you think about being an ally to science, and I think that, to me, is a great takeaway from this discussion, especially given that I think a lot of folks in this room aren't necessarily planning to be scientists, but we are planning to be thoughtful about using science in our lives, right? We believe in science. How many of you believe in gravity? Right. So, but to me, like when I have a conversation, when I have a conversation with somebody about, I hate the phrase, do you believe in climate science? Since when do you get to believe in a scientific theory? It's not religion. You can believe in religion, that's great. But we have allowed the dialogue around building the skepticism to create language in which we allow these types of phrases and we don't necessarily stop for a moment and question them. So I tend to respond with, do you believe in gravity? Which actually becomes a really kind of interesting conversation, right? I don't know if gravity is real. I just sort of trust that the theory makes sense and I'm still standing on the earth. I don't need to believe in climate change in order to recognize that it is probably a risk factor that should be accounted for as we think about how we manage things. And that's really what the military has done. If you follow this at all, you probably know that the United States military has done a tremendous amount of work around renewable energy, energy efficiency, reducing their carbon footprints. They see it as what they call a threat multiplier. They are in the business of risk management. They take it seriously because they take all kinds of things like that seriously. I also like to engage that piece of the discussion when I'm talking to folks. And it really is, as Francis talked about thinking about the person you're speaking to and what is their perspective that they're talking to you with, and how might you find ways to kind of just turn their thinking a little bit. That being said, I'm also no longer trying to turn anybody's minds. I actually, I think at a certain point we have to work with the folks who get it and try to bring the other folks along, but the more we do, the more we can demonstrate that there's benefit. And really, once people start to see benefit, because again, we're talking about economics, we're talking about politics, we're talking about power. I think that was a really particularly strong point. Power begets more power, and that's really what we're up against. We're up against a lot of entrenched interests that have power. Human beings are highly adaptable, but we don't like to be told to change, right? So if the change happens, we adapt. But if you tell me I have to change, that's really a daunting idea. So it's really about building the momentum around the adaptability. So in that regard, I'm going to switch real quick and talk a little bit about our plans. How much time do I have? Okay, so we came out with a strategy in August of 2015 called the Resilient New Orleans Strategy. It was the first comprehensive resilience strategy for a city in the world. And we did this before we did a climate action strategy, which is actually very strange for an American city. Most American cities did climate action strategies back in the early 2000s. We were busy doing something else. We were busy recovering from Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. It took us a long time. We were in acute recovery mode. So we as a city were not doing the same kind of work that other American cities were doing. And that's actually been very interesting, and I think it's serving us well as we really think about our future. So we came at this work from a different perspective, because resilience, and this speaks, I think, quite a bit to some of the things Francis was speaking to, resilience is about more than the environment. The environment is one factor as you think about all the ways in which you want to build resilience. Resilience is also about social cohesion. It's about economic opportunity. It's about a lot of different components. And so we have a three-part element to our resilience strategy. It's a three-part strategy. The Adapt to Thrive section is really the piece that kind of speaks to climate change, and it's really our adaptation strategy. And so in that sense, we're unique among American cities because most American cities did what they call climate mitigation or climate action, so how do we reduce our emissions? They did that first, and then as they were seeing more and more impacts of climate change in their cities, they kind of added adaptation chapters as they did their updates. We started from the opposite perspective because we had really already seen the effects of devastation. In our case, it wasn't directly caused by climate change, but we could see that these are the things that could be happening to us in the future. And so we, moving out of our recovery mode into resilience, then started work on our climate action strategy. So resilience strategy is Adapt to Thrive, Connecting to Opportunity, which is really about the social opportunity pieces. And there's, in each overall section, there are specific goals and strategies related to helping New Orleans be a more resilient city. And then really about how we're going to transform our built environment, our infrastructure, the things people build to manage living in our environment. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It is available online. It's really very interesting. I think it's really helpful to read as you think about how does this work fit in the broader body of thinking about how humans live in a world. You know, a lot of our systems, when Mark talked about water law and a lot of these elements, one of the things too to keep in mind is we used to live in a world with abundant natural resources and very few people. All of our systems are designed for that world. We now live in a world with fewer natural resources and a lot of people. We're having a massive shift, and our institutions, our laws, our way of even thinking about how we move through the world has to shift with that. A lot of folks I talk to can't really imagine that we're having the kind of impact on the planet that we are, because it's hard for them to imagine 9 billion people. So that is something, as you're graduating from college, as you're moving into the working world, that's not going to be so strange for you to imagine in the same way. But for a lot of folks in previous generations, it's totally different than how they ever were taught about the world, imagined the world. We're in this massive shift. And in that way, it's not enough to adapt. We also have to reduce our emissions. We have to think about how we reduce that impact. And we are one small city, but there's millions of cities. So we, as one small city, can do our part, and in working with other cities, we can make a difference. So I'm going to skip through this. We launched in July. This is our inventory. It's surprisingly low. It has to do with the fact that we have a lot of nuclear energy in our energy mix. So our emissions are actually lower than you might think they would be. Also, it's just for New Orleans, the city of New Orleans. So you think about a lot of that industrial activity that you see when you're driving in and out of the city. That's not accounted for in our emissions, because we have to, the way this works is you have to start somewhere and you have to draw a boundary, because you're trying to calculate things and it's a global problem, and you're trying to kind of think about it in the jurisdiction that you can do something in. And so ours is really only for the city of New Orleans. It's a goal as we move down the road to do more regional work and regional thinking about this, but that's something we have to work on as we go. We have a set of strategies in energy, in waste, in transportation. I'm not going to read them. You can read it online, nola.gov/climate action. But they're all designed to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030. We have a culture section. It's interesting, a lot of cities don't do this. My background is in doing a lot of outreach and communications around climate change. One quick tip, if you're interested in a lot of this type of stuff, there's a conference that happens once a year, usually in December, called the BEC Conference. It's the Behavior and Energy and Climate Change Conference. And it happens usually in DC or in Sacramento. It goes back and forth. There's a lot of stuff online. There's a lot of really interesting speeches, a lot of really interesting presentations about behavioral science study and how you can change people's behavior around energy and climate, and a lot of work done around kind of thinking about, let's not continue to believe that if we educate people and tell them what's right, that they'll do it, right? We're not rational in that way. It doesn't always work that way. There's actually been a lot of really interesting science over the last few years around how do you get people to change without really talking. You don't necessarily have to change their mind. You can just change kind of how they frame things. A lot of things around social norming, or, people don't like to waste, right? So loss aversion is actually a really big motivator. So it's really interesting work. If you're interested in this stuff at all, I highly recommend going online and looking at, there's a lot of abstracts and presentations you can see. So we used a tool that was developed by the World Bank, and we were able to access it. It's actually available for any city worldwide to use. And this tool is actually, we put all of our actions in. Our climate action strategy has 27 actions, put them all into the tool, and we calculated how are we going to get to our 50% target. And so there's a scientific basis, there's a thoughtful, analytic basis as to how we're going to get from here to there, which was very important to us. It was very important to the mayor. So this is a little bit about the tool. There's a process by which you identify what the city has control over, you identify the actions you want to take, you think about the action development, and it gives you ways to look at those results. This is what it looks like in the tool. So these are the two strategies. You can see the URLs at the bottom. And my email is at the bottom left if anybody has any questions, or if you want any sort of follow-up discussion about the city's strategy. After today, I'm happy to talk to anyone. Thank you.
Okay, we have a short 10 minutes or so for some questions. If you have a question, please come up to the microphone in the front here.
So you guys kind of talked about how climate change has kind of become this separating issue between two parties. So why do you think that climate change is now kind of being taken as a bipartisan issue?
Hopefully it's taken increasingly more as a bipartisan issue, but I don't think we're exactly there yet. I think that there was a discussion in the keynote speech about how politicians are fearful, right? And so the question now is, I think, are they kind of testing the waters, dipping their toes perhaps in the water to see what does the climate look like among their constituencies? So hopefully we get to the point where we have a shift there. I think it's important that, you know, I just want to put one point forward. I'm cognizant of the time.
No.
But the, you know, we know from psychological literature, all this, that, you know, humans are social animals, right? And you know, we reason, you know, there's this discussion of motivated reasoning, right? So that if we want to change minds, and I don't want to give up on it, you know, I think that it's possible, but what needs to happen though is that voices from the other side need to take this on, right? There need to be voices from the other side that say that no, this actually is a problem and we need to do something about it. And we know from the research that when you hear an opinion, right, when you're forming your view on something with new information, if that new information comes from someone from your side, right, you're much more likely to change your mind, okay? And so that needs to happen, right? And so if you're in a red district, talk to your representative, have them discuss this issue, and maybe that'll shift things along as well. But yeah.
If I could just be real quick about it, is that I think as Constantine just said, you know, for the most part, you know, the information does not convince anybody. The messenger convinces people. And increasingly what we're seeing, and I think, you know, we just heard that, I mean, cities aren't doing this stuff because they got nothing better to do. They're doing it because, A, they have the responsibility. I mean, state and local governments have a far greater suite of responsibilities than the federal government has. That's just the nature of sovereignty. So if nobody else is taking care of the problem, it falls to local government. And right now what we're seeing is local governments are faced with, I can't get insurance, my water supply is compromised, I'm looking at my tax base perhaps disappearing. I mean, you go to South Florida, you go to North Carolina, you go to Virginia, you come here, a number of other places, and it's not partisan. And so I think what's starting to happen is, the mayors in South Florida are the best advocates in Tallahassee that you have in Florida, because they're saying what we're facing is an issue. It is not a doctrine. So and as I mentioned, we're seeing that the decisions are being made in spite of cities and governments in industry. I mean, there's no question that the energy industry has already shifted. You could take all of the rules that have been put in place and coal's not coming back. That's already decided. There are a whole bunch of things that are already decided, and I think that the national conversation is the trailing edge of the knife. I think increasingly we have to look at those things on the front end. And as I say, it gives me some hope. My worry is we get smart too late for it to matter for a lot of the things we care about.
Yeah. I think it's on. Is it? Oh, it is on. Just to be clear, I don't want to say that it's not worth engaging the conversation, or I'm not worried about turning people's minds around. I just don't let that be my focus anymore. I'm much more focused on how do we get to solutions and stories and things we can speak to, because there are people who are entrenched and are not going to change their minds, and there are political interests that are entrenched, usually for economic reasons, that are not going to change their minds. And you waste a lot of time and energy trying to turn those people around and convince them. And in fact, there's just a lot of people in the middle who are undecided. And so, and it is about the messengers, and it is about sort of, but ultimately I really think it's about building that momentum. And to your question, I think there is momentum building at the local government level. It varies by location quite a bit. And there is a challenge in that in places that have politics that really support good climate policy, I find it's a challenge, and we as a city are kind of in the middle, and it's hard to be in the middle sort of anywhere anything anymore, right? Because we're in a very polarized environment. And the way, if you look at American cities now, you have a lot of American cities that are breakaway stars. They've got climate policies, like they're doing everything right. And they're building whole economies around it. And they're branding on it. And they're becoming, the places that they're the haves, right, to these kind of have-not places where it hasn't become a thing and people don't get it. And you're seeing a kind of a shift in the economic activity. And that worries me, because I think that we run the risk then of it being something that some people can have and other people can't have. And that's when we get into a problem, right? And so kind of keeping that conversation in sort of the middle space and really thinking about your local sort of needs and what your economic opportunities are there, and sort of all the various factors. And that is why, actually, in some ways, it's not a problem that this work is being largely done at cities. It's actually a good thing, because cities really know themselves much better than the federal government or the state government. But you do still have these issues. In Florida, it's still, I think it's still not allowed to say the words climate change, according to the state legislature. So when you have mayors actually engaging that, and you do have a lot of mayors doing a lot of work, but that's sort of, the opposition is creating a momentum, which is really good. But there's very few Republican governors who are really out in the lead on this. The most notable one is in San Diego. And he will really speak very heavily about Republicans, mayors. He will speak a lot about being a Republican mayor and how he is branded on this. But it's again about branding. And that, you got to be careful about that, because it's going to create more schisms in the future, I think.
I would just quickly add, I don't know if this is working. I think, as has been mentioned, experiences matter. And so experiences don't necessarily follow political lines. And so we do know that disasters and certain impacts of climate change are going to continue to be experienced by all, although in different ways. And I think for me, that gives me hope that we're going to be able to address these issues in more collaborative and equitable ways, because you can't fight experiences. When you experience something firsthand, or your mother or your cousin or your friend who lives elsewhere experiences a particular type of trauma, or you experience people migrating to your city or your region because their localities are not inhabitable anymore, that matters, and people start to talk about issues in different ways.
Okay, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up. I do want to point out Constantine Boussalis' talk is this Thursday at 4 o'clock at the Stone Auditorium on U.S. cities and climate change. Please do join us for that. And then I was going to put up the next one. Catherine Hayhoe will be on the second keynote at 3:30. All right. Thank you all for coming, and thank the panelists, please.